One of my favorite ways to add texture in my vector artwork in Adobe Illustrator is by using scatter brushes, like this one. You can see how it looks, and it's really nicely randomized, has enough variety. And as you can see in this illustration, I applied it both as part of clipping masks and also as part of an opacity mask, which we can see on the wolf head. But let me show you first of all how to create this. It's a very simple technique. I'm going to do this here on the canvas. I'm just using the brush tool, and I'm going to use the default calligraphic brush. So first of all, you want to create small little dots or speckles, just randomly scattered around, a few of them, and you can just use the mouse for this, just like that. Now use the right square bracket to increase your brush size a bit. Put a few of these down as well. Then you can maybe have a few even smaller ones scattered around. And then once you have enough, maybe you can have a little bit more in the center. Once you have enough, you can select all of these together. And the next thing normally, what I do before I save this as a brush, is to expand the appearance from the object menu. This allows us to do the next step, which would be from the effect menu, going into the distort and transform section. And here I like to use tweak. So once you select this, this is going to give a little bit of randomness to each of the shapes. And of course you can control how much you want these shapes to be distorted. You can make it very extreme, both horizontally and vertically, but I'm just going to keep them low, something like that. Click OK. And now let's take a look at this without the selection. As you can see, it clearly randomized these little dots. And now if I have them all selected, all I have to do is to just drop them into the brushes panel. And then of course choose scatter brush when it's created. The settings that work best really depends on the style of your illustration and also the brush template that you created. But normally I would go to a lower size than the original one that you drew. I would also reduce the spacing, probably go down to maybe 30% for now. Let's just try it. Then you can also have a little bit of scatter if you want, but normally actually I would keep this 0%. So that way it will stay closer to the brush stroke that you create. The rotation should be set to random, and you can drag this one to -180 and this one to 180, or you can keep that even in 0. And one last thing that you have to make sure is that the colorization method is set to tints. This is going to allow you to change the color and be able to paint with whatever color you want. Click OK, and once you select a color for your stroke, make sure that the brush you created is also selected. And then with the brush tool, you can already start drawing with this new texture brush. And of course, adding more lines, you can build up the effect so you can have a little bit more dots in the center. You can also select individual anchor points on multiple lines and move them around. So that's also a cool way to adjust the texture. Once again, these points I can select and move them around, and fold up the texture if I want to, or drag it more out. And of course, the lines will update and introduce additional dots along the way when the line is getting longer. Now it's also great that you can anytime go back to the settings for the brush by double clicking on its thumbnail, and there you will be able to make amends. So for instance, if I want the size to be also randomized, that's again something that we can do similarly to randomizing the rotation. And this way again, I can maybe set up the values between 50% and 20%. And immediately you can see, as long as the preview is turned on your artboard, it will show you how this affects your existing brush strokes. If that's a little bit too much randomization on the scale, you can maybe get these two values closer to each other. So I'm only giving a tolerance between 30 to 50% of the original size. And now, just to test drive this brush, I'm going to select the hood of Little Red Riding Hood, and I'm going to choose this option, Draw Inside, which is a brilliant quick way to turn this into a clipping mask. I'm going to reselect my brush, and using that darker color, I can start adding this texture in here and nicely build it up along the edges. I can also add a couple of dots a little bit with darker color. Again, add more at the bottom. And then maybe I can use a brighter color with the same brush and maybe add a few of those dots here as a highlight. Once I'm done with drawing inside the shape, I just have to remember to switch back to draw normal, either by clicking on this icon or pressing Shift D on the keyboard. And by taking a look at this from a distance, we can tell that our texture brush is working really well. Using the grain effect is another brilliant way to introduce textures to your illustrations. I'm going to show you this on the surfboard, but you can already see that it's been applied on a couple of different areas. So first of all, here we have the shapes for the surfboard, but I already created an additional shape which I'm going to use for the effect itself. So now that this is selected, I can apply a simple black and white gradient on it. For now, I'm just using a linear gradient. And then I can go to the effect menu and choose texture, grain. These are the settings I like to use. The grain type set to stippled. The intensity I keep around 36 and contrast on 0. Once we click OK, we can see how this looks. And if I press G on the keyboard, I can redraw the gradient and we can see how it's being built. So that is looking quite good. And I would want to use this here on the bottom of the surfboard as a shading. So that's great, but we can't see the original colors that we used for the surfboard. And that is because this needs to be set to multiply blend mode. So from the transparency panel, I switch to multiply. But to be able to change the color of this texture, we will have to do a couple of additional steps, which will also help to vectorize this effect. Because if we zoom closer, you will notice that this is actually a raster effect. And it relies on the raster effect settings that you can check from the effect menu. So if I go to document raster effect settings, right now I'm using 72 ppi. If I want to have this finer, I can go and increase the resolution. So when I do this, we will see more finer pixel details. But in this case, I actually prefer them to be larger. So I just went back one step. And instead, I'm going to go to the object menu and choose expand appearance, which then turns this effect into a pixel image, which then can be traced using the image trace option. And then click on the additional settings, which is the image trace panel. Open up the advanced settings. And I actually have a preset saved for this noise effect, which I'm just going to choose from here. And I'm not going to walk you through these settings because you can see them here on my screen. Just take a screenshot of it and apply them. And once you have the settings applied, all you have to do to finalize this effect is to click on expand here on the top. Now we are ready to change the color. So for instance, I can select red and then we can zoom out and check out how this looks. It's a really nice subtle effect, but of course we can use the darker red if we wanted to. We can even use this pink color or a blue one. And of course, we can also control its intensity by reducing the opacity if we wanted to. And one final quick tip, if you want to apply the same effect around the edges of an object, like this cloud for instance, you can also apply it on the stroke. So instead of having the gradient on the fill, just have the stroke selected, add your black to white gradient. Make sure you increase the thickness of the stroke and also change the stroke setting to the apply gradient across stroke option. This way you will be able to create a transition from the center of the object towards the edges. And once this is created, just go and apply the same effect as before. So I choose apply grain. We can see it already there. And once again, by increasing the thickness of the stroke, I can expand this or make it narrower. And with the midpoint slider here, I can also control the transition once again. It's a very cool effect, and the only thing you have to keep in mind if you keep vectorizing the results, it might make your file a little bit slower to load because it creates a lot of anchor points and objects. That happens every time you are using the image trace feature and you expand it. Before we continue with the rest of the techniques, I wanted to share something exciting with you. All of the examples I'm using in this video were made for our Illustrator Fast Track course. And as a special gift to you, I am offering you access to one of the 9 illustration projects for free. All you need to do is to click on the link in the description below to enroll. You will receive the exercise files so you can follow along and a special discount in case you decide to unlock all the other projects, additional lessons and extra resources. Don't miss out on this amazing opportunity. And now let's continue with the next Illustrator texture effect. Now here's another fun technique, using the symbol tools to create texture in your illustrations. First of all, I'm going to zoom closer and I will use the star tool. Holding down the shift key, I will set up my star here. And thanks to these new features in Illustrator that we can control a lot of the attributes of the star easily, I'm going to set it for 4 points. Then I'm going to make this smaller, the inner radius, something like that. Then we can round these inner corners down, and maybe also the outer corners can be rounded down like that. And that's already a cool little symbol we could use, but I'm going to go one step further. I'm going to copy paste this, Command C, Command F on Mac, or Control C, Control F on PC. Then rotate this holding down the shift key, and I'm just going to hold down the Alt or Option key to resize this, and also the shift key is good to hold down so you avoid distorting it. Just create something like that. And maybe these points can be even smaller, so maybe round it down even more. Now just have to make sure that both of these shapes are selected from the Layers panel. And while they are selected, go to the Pathfinder panel and choose the first option to unite them. So this is going to create a single shape from them. And now I'm just going to make it smaller, holding down Alt and Shift key together to roughly the size that I think will work well on this illustration, and then drag and drop this into the Symbols panel. That's going to define this as a new symbol. I just call it star. And now we can grab our symbol tools. Here you can see we have loads of them, so I recommend clicking on this icon to bring it out as a floating panel. And to populate the illustration with the symbols, first of all, you will need the symbol sprayer tool. I will just zoom out so you can see what's going to happen. I can start drawing these and really just add as much as I want on the illustration. And when I feel like there is enough of them, I can switch to the second tool called Symbol Shifter. With this, I can herd the stars around, move them in the areas where I feel like they are going to work best. And then if I want to vary their size, I can also use this fourth tool, that's the symbol sizer. If I hold it on a specific area, it's going to keep increasing the instances there. If I hold down the Alt or Option key, I can also make them smaller. So I can very quickly create more variety. And even cooler than this, I can also spin them around randomly. So if I choose the fifth tool, with this I can start adjusting their angle and again just introduce more variety and interest. And of course you can keep switching back and forth between these tools. And the best thing about using symbols is that it's going to be a single object in your layers panel. So it's a very tidy way to introduce texture. You can see it's a single object, and I can always come back and make changes to it using the symbol tools. In this example, you can see that I applied an opacity mask with a texture to create this distress effect or grunge effect on this illustration. And I can just hold down the shift key and click on the opacity mask to turn it off temporarily, just so you can see without it. Once again, with it together, and then Alt or Option click on the opacity mask will show us the mask itself. So whatever texture you apply here, just make sure you set it to black. That way the texture itself is going to be used to hide details, because black hides, white shows. So I'm going to Alt or Option click again on the mask just to switch back to the normal state. And by the way, since the opacity mask is selected, I can also just turn off this path from here temporarily. Now you can easily find textures like these on websites like FreePic. If you search for vector assets, type in texture, choose free license, you will find loads of really good ones, like these ones right here. These are already in vector format, you just have to place them into your opacity mask. Or alternatively, you can use AI generated images as well. Like this one, for instance, I created on Midjourney. You can see my prompt here on the right side. And this just needs to be vectorized using image trace, which I can show you very quickly. If I just copy this image, I drop it into Illustrator, straight into the opacity mask, as you can see it. So I can see whether it's worth vectorizing this or not. I'm just going to resize it quickly and move it around. Maybe a little bit more distress effect here on the left side will look quite cool. And now I can just choose image trace, or I can even just use quickly the same settings that I used in the previous effect. And that looks really cool. I'm just going to move it a little bit higher so it doesn't interfere with the text. Something like that. So let's again check before and after. Now, any texture that you vectorized already can also be used as an art brush. Like this one here, I can just drag and drop into my brushes panel and choose Artbrush. This will have a direction, and I normally prefer to use the default settings apart from the method that I like to set to tints. And in case the texture itself was too big, maybe you can just reduce the width so it doesn't end up being too large in your illustration. But once it's ready, we can start applying it in the illustration, and you can see I'm using a clipping mask here to only add the texture on a specific part on the hair, and that's exactly the same thing I've done here on the neck and also on some other parts of the illustration. And again, it just adds a nice visual interest together with the shading that we are applying. And one of the cool things that you can do with art brushes is that you combine it with the dashed line feature. So once again, this is applied on a path. And when I go into the appearance panel, I can click on the stroke settings and just turn on dashed line. This way, the art brush also becomes a bit like a pattern brush. And if I want longer dashes, like 100 points, I can of course increase that. And if my line is longer, then of course there will be more space for each of these instances to appear. And of course, by default, the gap is set to be the same size as the dash itself. But if we reduce the gap to 0 points, then immediately we get more repetition within that path. Now, in some cases, you might only want to apply the texture around the edges of objects. Like here, as you can see in this example, I have the texture applied on the stroke. And to be able to create this, first you have to create a pattern brush. Now, let me show you this from scratch, how I create it normally. So I would draw a black rectangle, something like that. Then I go to the effect menu, and from the distort and transform section, I choose roughen. I normally like the detail to be set to maximum and the size to be maybe 1%, so very low. The points can be set to smooth or corner, whichever you prefer. And then when you click OK, you can see that we have this rough edge. Now we can select this and go to the object menu, choose expand appearance, then use the eraser tool, which is Shift E, and then holding down Alt or Option key, we can delete one side and then the other side. We only need a small section like that. And then to make sure that it's going to work continuously in a pattern brush, I will have to duplicate this. But the way I do that is by using the reflect tool. That's O on the keyboard. Then first make sure you click on one of the anchor points on the edge, and then click and drag the shape, hold down Alt or Option and Shift keys together. That way you created a perfect reflection. So now the points in the middle will match, but also the points around the edges will match. Now we can just select these two shapes together, and with the Pathfinder we can unite them. And then we can drag and drop them in the brushes panel and save it as a pattern brush. The colorization method, again, should be set to tints, and most of the other settings you don't really have to worry about. You can just click OK. So we can just test this out on a shape. I'm just going to draw a circle right here. Let's zoom a little bit closer. As you can see, I have the same color both on the fill and the stroke. And then while this is selected, I can just click on the brush that we created. And voila, we have the textured edge. And if you find that the texture is too crude and you want it finer, just double click on the brush and reduce the scale right here. And you can even see the preview. We can very quickly make it finer or also more rough if that works better with the illustration. And last but not least, using halftone effect is also a cool way to add some visual interest and use it as a texture in your illustrations. So this is very simple. You just have to have an object selected and add an additional fill with a gradient. Again, a black and white linear gradient will work. Or of course, you can use it with radial gradients as well. The opacity you should set to multiply. That way it can blend together with whatever fill color you are using. And the effect itself is called Color Halftone, which you can find from the effect menu under Pixelate there is color halftone. And these are the settings that I would normally use. The most important thing is to make sure that all the channels are the same value. And the radius is going to control the size of the circles that you will see. I can reduce this down to maybe 20 pixels, and then immediately it's going to update. And we will have a finer halftone effect created, but also don't forget that this is a raster effect. So again, it's going to work based on the document raster effect settings. So if you increase that or decrease it, it will affect the appearance of your halftone effects unless you expand and image trace them. So there you go, 7 different ways to create textures in Adobe Illustrator. I hope you found this tutorial useful. If you want to learn more from us, make sure you subscribe and don't forget to sign up for the free course, for which the link is in the description below. Thanks a lot for watching, and I will see you in the next one.